This is messy. It involves my brother, Colin, his dream, and a whole lot of my hard-earned cash. Buckle up because this is going to be a long one. You're wasting your life, Ethan. 2 jobs, that's not ambition, that's desperation. Those were Colin's words, spoken with that smug, superior tone he always adopted whenever he felt the need to justify his own lack of progress. He said it the night I told him I was covering his rent again. Colin's 3 years younger than me. Think golden retriever energy with the follow-through of a sloth. He's always chasing some new passion. This time, it was photography. He'd decided he was going to be a world-renowned photographer, capturing the soul of humanity one expertly framed shot at a time. Sounds great, right? Except months had gone by, and the only thing he was capturing was dust on his unpaid bills. He was good at the talk, though. Damn, the kid could sell snow to an Eskimo. He'd pull out his laptop, show me these stunning landscapes, portraits that practically breathed, and go on and on about how Vogue or National Geographic or whatever fancy publication was this close to giving him his big break. He'd drop names of people he'd networked with, throwing around industry jargon like he was already a seasoned pro. Our parents had given up on him years ago. Dad, bless his blunt heart, finally put his foot down. Colin's gotta learn to swim on his own, Ethan. We're not doing him any favors by constantly throwing him a life raft. Mom reluctantly agreed. Shocking, really. She'd always been Colin's biggest defender, believing in him even when he gave her approximately 0 reasons to. We're not helping him become independent, she'd said, her voice heavy with the weight of disappointed hopes. We're enabling him. So, the responsibility, as it so often did in my life, fell squarely on my shoulders. I'm Ethan, the responsible one. The guy who patches up the holes when everyone else throws their hands up and walks away. I work 2 jobs. Days, I'm on a construction site, hauling lumber, sweating through the Texas heat, and generally breaking my back to keep things afloat. Nights, I deliver pizzas for a local joint. It's not glamorous. Hell, it's brutal. But it pays the bills. My bills, Colin's bills, and the occasional emergency, when Colin's latest grand scheme inevitably implodes. The irony? He had the nerve to criticize me for it. 2 jobs, Ethan. Do you really think that kind of grind is living? He'd be sprawled out on my okay-hour couch, sipping some overpriced artisanal coffee he'd bought instead of, groceries, telling me how sad it was that I worked as hard as I did, all while I was paying his rent. Believe me, the thought of cutting him loose crossed my mind more times than I can count. Every time I saw my bank account dwindling, every time I dragged myself home after a soul-crushing double shift, the image of him lounging around, doing nothing, would flash in my head. But then he'd call. Hey man, this client's being a pain. They want like 1 million edits but don't want to pay extra. It's messed up. Or, my camera needs a tune-up. Can't shoot anything until I get it looked at, but the shop wants like $300. Always something. Always one more obstacle standing between him and his success. The thing is, Colin does have potential. I hate admitting it, but it's true. His photos are legitimately stunning. He has an eye for composition, a knack for capturing the raw emotion of a moment. And he's got charisma. He could charm the pants off a rattlesnake, but instead of actually working to achieve his goals, he just leaned on me hard. It wasn't just the rent. I was buying his groceries, covering his utilities, even shelling out cash for those networking events that were supposed to be career changers. I even asked him once why he didn't just get a part-time job, until things picked up. His answer? Dude, that's a distraction. I'm building something real here. You wouldn't get it. You're too stuck in the grind. But when this takes off, you'll see. I'll pay you back. With interest. Spoiler alert, it never took off. But somehow, he always managed to talk me into keeping the gravy train running. He'd remind me that I had the steady income, that my 2 jobs made it easy for me to pitch in. He'd say I was investing in him, in the family, and, like the idiot I apparently am, I continued to believe him. At first, I didn't mind helping. I figured everyone needs a leg up, right? Colin was young, talented, just needed some time to find his footing. But as the months turned into a year, the resentment started to fester. The construction job was brutal. Early mornings, long hours, back-breaking work, It drained me physically, sucking the life out of me. I'd clock out, grab a stale sandwich from the gas station, and head straight to my pizza delivery gig. That was a whole different kind of hell. Rude customers, endless traffic, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that made it hard to even think. Meanwhile, Colin would be home during the day, editing, or reaching out to clients. I'd come home to find him sprawled out on the couch, scrolling through Instagram or binging Netflix, usually wearing the same clothes he'd had on that morning. "You have no idea how stressful this is," he'd say, whenever I dared to call him out on his lack of, well, anything. "Every day I'm hustling, putting myself out there. It's not like you've ever had to deal with rejection like this." That's the thing about Colin. He always made it sound like what he was doing was so much harder than what I was doing. Like his struggles were somehow bigger, more valid than mine. And maybe, for a while, I believed it. But after months of picking up his slack while he sat around doing the bare minimum, I started to see things differently. Our parents saw it long before I did. "You're enabling him, Ethan," Dad told me during one of our weekly phone calls. "He'll never grow up if he keeps getting bailed out." Mom agreed. A rare occurrence when it came to Colin. "We love him, Ethan, but it's not fair to you," she said, her voice unusually firm. "He's got to learn to make it on his own." But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't help him, no one else would. So, I kept going. I kept paying his rent. I kept believing his excuses. I kept telling myself that the next month would be different. It wasn't. And then, the breaking point. I'll never forget that night. Not because of Colin, but because the universe decided to pile on everything else in my life at once. It started with a call from my construction site foreman. The company had lost a major contract, and they were cutting hours across the board. And of course, my name was at the top of the list. "It's only temporary, Ethan," he said, his voice laced with that familiar corporate BS. "We'll call you back in a few weeks when things pick up." Weeks. I couldn't afford a few weeks. Rent was due next week, and I was already stretched thin. Then, during my pizza shift, my car battery decided to die. In the middle of a delivery, on the other side of town, in rush hour traffic, I had to call a tow truck, explain to my increasingly irritated boss why I couldn't finish my deliveries, and endure the stink eye from every customer who was waiting on their lukewarm pepperoni. I ended up losing the rest of my tips for the night and getting hit with a $200 bill for a replacement battery. By the time I finally limped home, it was after midnight, and I felt like I'd aged 10 years in a single day. When I opened the door to our apartment, the first thing I saw was Colin, sitting in the living room. But it wasn't the usual scene. This time he wasn't just sitting there. He was sitting with a group of people I didn't recognize, laughing, like he didn't have a care in the world. There were half-empty beer bottles scattered on the coffee table, pizza boxes, definitely not from my job, overflowing with crusts. Music blaring so loud I could feel the bass vibrating through my bones. I just stood there for a second, completely frozen. Every muscle in my body ached, every nerve ending screamed in protest. Colin noticed me and grinned, that infuriating, carefree grin that always managed to push me over the edge. "Hey, Ethan, you're back. Perfect timing, we're out of beer. Want to grab some?" I didn't even answer. I walked straight past them, into the kitchen, where I found my wallet lying open on the counter. A couple of 20s were missing. My stomach dropped. I stormed back into the living room. "Where's my money, Colin?" I demanded, my voice surprisingly calm, considering the rage boiling inside me. He barely looked up from his conversation. "Relax, man, I borrowed it. I'll pay you back after my next gig." "What gig, Colin?" I snapped, my voice rising. "You haven't had a gig in months." His friends fell silent, shifting awkwardly in their seats. Colin, though, just grinned. "Okay, mister. Overreaction. It's $20. Don't pretend you're broke." That was it. The car repair, the job cuts, the months of carrying him, the constant condescension. It all boiled over, a volcano of resentment erupting inside me. "Get out," I said, my voice still calm, but now laced with a cold, hard edge. Colin blinked. "What?" "You heard me," I said, my eyes locked on his. "Get out. You're done here, Colin. No more rent, no more food, no more loans you'll never pay back. I'm done." His friends looked at him, waiting for his reaction. I expected him to apologize, to beg, maybe even to get angry. Instead, he laughed. Wow, Ethan, you're really gonna kick me out over $20? Talk about dramatic. Not over $20, I said, my voice rising. No, Colin, over everything, over the rent I've been paying for a year, over the food you eat without ever pitching in, over the fact that you're out partying while I'm working 2 jobs to keep this place running. His smirk finally faded. A flicker of something, uncertainty, maybe even fear, crossed his face. You're not serious. Oh, I'm serious, I said, my voice trembling with anger. You have a week to find somewhere else to live. He started to argue, to launch into another one of his elaborate justifications. But I cut him off. I don't want to hear it, Colin. I'm done being your safety net. I turned and walked out, slamming the door to my bedroom behind me. I heard him arguing with his friends, trying to convince them that I was just blowing off steam. I didn't care. I crawled into bed, exhausted and emotionally drained. I knew I had done the right thing, that I had finally drawn a line in the sand, but it didn't feel good. Not at all. The next morning, he was gone. I woke up the next morning half expecting Colin to still be there, sprawled out on the couch, surrounded by beer bottles and pizza crusts, maybe with a half-hearted apology or some flimsy excuse about needing more time. But he wasn't. His room was empty, except for a pile of dirty laundry on the floor and a few band posters he hadn't bothered to take down. A ghost of his presence lingered in the air, a mixture of cheap cologne and unrealized potential. I didn't feel any relief, though. If anything, I felt a strange mixture of anger and guilt churning in my gut. It wasn't that I wanted him to fail. I just couldn't carry the 2 of us anymore. I was drowning, and he was using me as a life raft. Around noon, my phone started buzzing like a swarm of angry bees. Caller ID, Colin. I ignored him. The first few times anyway. But he kept calling, relentlessly. Finally, when he started leaving voicemails, each one more frantic than the last, I caved. I answered. Dude, what the hell? He yelled, his voice raw with desperation. I got nowhere to go. That was the first message. By the third, his tone had shifted, morphing from anger to pleading. You can't seriously leave me like this, Ethan. You're my brother. I hung up without saying a word. I couldn't deal with it. Not then. That night, he showed up at the apartment. Unannounced, of course. He looked different, disheveled, stressed, like the weight of reality had finally settled on his shoulders, crushing him under its immense pressure. Can we talk? He asked, his voice low and strained. I crossed my arms, my body instinctively bracing for another round of manipulation, but I nodded. He sighed, running a hand through his already messy hair. Look, man, I just need some more time. I'm meeting with a guy next week who's really interested in my portfolio. He works for a legit agency. This is real, Ethan. This time I swear it is. He looked me straight in the eye, trying to project an air of sincerity. But I could see the desperation lurking beneath the surface, the fear that he was about to lose everything. Just cover me for another month, he continued, his voice softening. I'll pay you back as soon as I get the job, I promise. I stared at him, searching for any sign of genuine change, but all I saw was the same old pattern, the same empty promises, the same reliance on me to fix his problems. You've been saying that for a year, Colin, I said, my voice flat. Why should I believe you now? Because it's different this time, he said, a little too quickly. I've got momentum now. People are noticing my work. You'll see, it'll pay off. Big time. I shook my head. No, Colin, I've heard it all before. I can't do it anymore. He laughed bitterly, a harsh, hollow sound that sent a shiver down my spine. Wow, so much for family, huh? You'd rather watch me fail than help me one last time? No, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, even though every nerve in my body was screaming. I'd rather see you succeed, because you deserve it, not because I keep bailing you out. He just stared at me for a long moment, as if he didn't recognize me, as if I'd suddenly transformed into some cold, heartless stranger. Then he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Without another word, I thought that was the end of it, that he'd finally gotten the message, that he was finally going to take responsibility for his own life. I should have known better. For a few days, it was blissfully quiet. No texts, no phone calls, no random knocks on the door. I started to think that maybe, just maybe, Colin was finally taking me seriously. Maybe he'd finally decided to step up and figure things out on his own. But then, late one night, I heard a knock at the door. Not the casual, friendly kind of knock, but the frantic, desperate kind. The kind that makes your heart pound in your chest and sends a cold shiver down your spine. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I wasn't home, to let him deal with the consequences of his actions. But I couldn't. Against my better judgment, I opened the door, and there he was, Colin, looking worse than I'd ever seen him. His hair was a greasy mess, his clothes were wrinkled and stained, and his eyes were bloodshot and hollow, as if he hadn't slept in days. His face was gaunt, his skin pale. He looked like a ghost of his former self. "I need your help," he said, his voice shaking, barely above a whisper. I let him in, more by instinct than by conscious choice. He slumped down on the couch, his body seemingly deflating with each passing second. The air around him felt heavy with desperation. "What's going on, Colin?" I asked, my voice laced with a weariness that mirrored his own. He avoided my gaze, staring down at his hands, which were trembling slightly. "I tried, Ethan. I really tried. I called every contact I had. I even applied for a couple of retail jobs just to stay afloat. But nobody's hiring. I'm out of options, man." His voice cracked on the last word, a raw, vulnerable sound that tugged at something deep inside me. I tried to ignore it, to harden my heart against the pity I knew he was trying to elicit. "Where have you been living?" I asked, forcing myself to remain detached. He hesitated for a moment, then mumbled, "With a guy I met on a shoot a few months ago." "And?" I prompted, knowing there was more to the story. He finally looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and resentment. "He kicked me out yesterday, said I wasn't pulling my weight." He paused, swallowing hard. "I've been sleeping in my car ever since." I wanted to feel bad for him, I really did, but part of me couldn't help but think, this is exactly what everyone said would happen. "I'm sorry, Colin," I said, trying to sound firm but not heartless. "But I meant what I said. You're going to have to figure this out for yourself." His head snapped up, his eyes widening with disbelief. "Are you serious? I'm homeless, Ethan. I don't even have enough gas to drive somewhere else." "That's not my fault," I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts. "I've been covering for you for over a year. I warned you this would happen." "I thought you had my back," he shouted, his voice laced with betrayal. "You always told me that family sticks together no matter what. Now you're just turning your back on me?" "Family sticks together when everyone pulls their weight," I shot back, my anger finally breaking through. "This isn't about me turning my back on you, Colin. It's about you never stepping up in the first place." He looked like he was about to argue, to launch into another one of his self-pitying rants. But then, something inside him seemed to break. His shoulders slumped, his eyes lost their fire, and the fight seemed to drain out of him. He leaned forward and rubbed his face with his hands, his body shaking slightly. Can you at least lend me some money for gas?" he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I'll pay you back when I can." I sighed, the last of my resistance crumbling away. "Fine. $20. That's it." He nodded, took the money without another word, and turned to leave. For a moment, I felt relieved. I thought that maybe, just maybe, this would be the last time I'd have to deal with this. That he'd finally hit rock bottom and would have no choice but to start climbing back up. But something about the way he looked at me as he walked out, the hollow emptiness in his eyes, made me doubt it. It felt like I was just delaying the inevitable. For a few weeks, Colin was completely silent. No phone calls, no texts, no sudden visits. I didn't know where he was or what he was doing, but I figured it was better that way. I needed the space to breathe, to heal, to try and rebuild my own life after the financial and emotional wreckage he'd left behind. I focused on my own struggles. The construction company called me back, and I started getting regular hours again. My car was running fine after the new battery, and for the first time in months, I actually had some money left at the end of each paycheck. I even treated myself to a decent steak. But of course, peace never lasts where Colin is concerned. It was a Friday night. I'd just finished my pizza delivery shift, and I was finally home. I'd cracked open a cold beer, sunk into my worn-out armchair, and was just starting to relax, thinking I'd watch some mindless TV when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. Caller ID, Colin. My heart sank. I stared at the phone for a long moment, debating whether or not to answer. Every instinct screamed at me to ignore it, to let it go to voicemail, to protect myself from whatever new crisis he was about to throw my way. But something held me back, a flicker of hope maybe, or a morbid curiosity, or maybe just the stubborn, ingrained sense of responsibility that had plagued me my entire life. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Hey," he said, his voice sounding surprisingly casual, as if nothing had happened. "What's up, Colin?" I asked, getting right to the point. "What do you want?" He chuckled awkwardly. "Man, you're always so direct. Can't I just call and check in?" "No, you can't," I said, my voice hardening. "So, what is it?" There was a pause. A long, pregnant silence that stretched my nerves to the breaking point. Then, he sighed. "All right, fine, look, I need a favor, just one little thing." I closed my eyes, already bracing myself for the worst. "What now, Colin?" I asked, my voice laced with exasperation. "I got this opportunity," he said, his voice suddenly animated, a spark of the old Colin flickering back to life. "A real gig, Ethan. With a local ad agency. They loved my portfolio. They want me to shoot a whole campaign for them. Imagine the exposure!" I could practically hear the dollar signs ringing in his voice. He was back in salesman mode, pitching me a dream he hadn't earned. But I refused to bite. "There's a catch, though," he continued, his tone shifting slightly, a hint of nervousness creeping in. Of course there was a catch. There was always a catch with Colin. "I need a better lens," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "For the kind of shots they want, I need something sharper, something with a wider aperture. This old thing I have just isn't going to cut it." He paused, waiting for my reaction. I remained silent, letting him squirm. "It's only a few $100, he added quickly, as if trying to minimize the request. "And as soon as I get paid for the job, I'll pay you back. I swear to God, Ethan, this isn't like before, this is real. This could change everything," I laughed, a short bitter sound that echoed in the small apartment. "Are you serious, Colin? You're asking me for money again. After everything that's happened?" "This is different," he protested, his voice rising defensively. "This isn't rent or food or whatever. This is an investment. If I nail this campaign, it's going to open so many doors for me. I just need a little help to get there." I shook my head, the weariness washing over me again, heavier than before. "You really think I'm going to fall for that again? How many opportunities have you pitched me, Colin? How many times have I heard, 'This one's different'?" I paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "And what do I have to show for it?" I asked, my voice low and dangerous. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because he knew the answer. Nothing but a drained bank account and a mountain of resentment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he said quietly, "So, that's it? You won't help me?" His voice was laced with a mixture of disappointment and accusation. He was trying to make me feel guilty, to make me believe that I was the one standing in the way of his success, but I wasn't buying it. "After all I've been through?" he added, trying to press his advantage. "After everything you've been through?" I shot back, my anger flaring again. "What about everything I've been through, Colin? I've been through more than you know, and I'm tired of paying for your dreams when you can't even be bothered to work for them." He opened his mouth to argue, to launch into another one of his self-serving justifications, but I didn't give him the chance. I hung up the phone. I threw the phone on the couch and sat there, staring at the wall, my chest heaving. I knew I had done the right thing, that I had finally put my foot down, but it didn't feel good, not at all. It felt like I was watching him drown and refusing to throw him a life raft. But I knew, deep down, that throwing him another life raft wouldn't save him. It would just prolong the inevitable. He needed to learn to swim on his own. After that phone call, I thought Colin was finally getting the message, that he'd hit rock bottom, that I'd drawn a line in the sand. Surely he'd have no choice but to figure it out, right? Wrong. 1 week later, I came home from work to find a note taped to my door. It was from my landlord. My heart sank. The note was short and to the point. Notice of overdue rent. Immediate payment required to avoid eviction. Eviction? I had paid my rent on time every month for the past 2 years. There had to be some mistake. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking. I rushed inside, pulled up my banking app on my phone, and started to comb through my recent transactions. That's when I saw it. A $700 withdrawal from my account. 3 days ago. A withdrawal that I didn't authorize. My stomach churned. It didn't take long to figure out who was behind it. Colin had access to my account. I'd given him my PIN months ago. A stupid, impulsive act of generosity I now deeply regretted. He'd needed groceries, and I was running late for work. He didn't have his wallet. Just grab some stuff from my account. I'll tell you the PIN later. He'd written it down on a scrap of paper. I'd forgotten all about it. Until now. Rage surged through me, a molten lava of fury that threatened to consume me. I wanted to scream, to break things, to unleash my anger on something, anything. But I forced myself to take a deep breath, to regain control. I needed to confront him. I dialed his number, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. He answered on the second ring. "What's up?" he said, sounding far too cheerful for my taste. "Where's my money, Colin?" I said, cutting straight to the point. There was a long, pregnant pause. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice suddenly guarded. "You know exactly what I mean," I said, my voice icy. $700 gone from my account. 3 days ago. Care to explain? Another pause. This one even longer. Then a nervous laugh. "Oh, that," he said, his voice trying to sound nonchalant. "Look, man, I was going to tell you. I just needed it. For the lens. For that gig I told you about. I was going to pay you back as soon as I got the check." "You stole from me," I said, the words dripping with venom. "Come on, Ethan, it's not like that," he said quickly, his voice rising in panic. "I thought you'd understand. This gig is huge, and I didn't have time to wait for you to say yes. I had to act fast." I couldn't believe what I was hearing, the sheer audacity of it. "Do you even hear yourself right now?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger. "You took my money without asking me, and now I'm about to get evicted because of you." "Evicted?" he said, his tone suddenly shifting from defensive to accusatory. "How is that my fault? You're the one with 2 jobs. You can't tell me you don't have enough to pay the rent. You're just being dramatic." I was too stunned to speak for a moment. The sheer gall of the man took my breath away. "You are unbelievable," I finally managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. "I've done everything for you, Colin. I've carried you for a year. And this is how you repay me?" "I had no choice," he snapped back, his voice laced with resentment. "You don't get it. When you chase your dreams, sometimes you have to take risks." "You didn't take a risk, Colin," I shouted, my voice finally cracking. "You made me take them for you, and now I'm done. For real, this time. I'm completely and utterly done." I hung up the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I was beyond anger. I was numb. The next few days were a blur of frantic activity. I scrambled to make rent before the eviction notice became official. It meant dipping into my savings, what little I had left, and taking on extra shifts at both jobs, but I managed to pull it off. Barely. I paid the rent. I avoided eviction. I survived. Colin, on the other hand, went radio silent. No calls, no texts, nothing. Part of me was relieved. I needed the space to breathe, to deal with the mess he'd made. But another part of me was terrified. I knew, deep down, that this couldn't be the end, that he would resurface eventually, and when he did, it wouldn't be good. Then, like clockwork, he resurfaced. When I least expected it. When I was just starting to feel like I might actually be able to put my life back together. It was a Saturday morning. I'd just brewed a pot of coffee, thinking I'd finally get a quiet moment to myself. The knock on the door shattered that illusion. It was a slow, deliberate knock. Not frantic, not desperate, but somehow even more ominous. I knew before I even opened the door who was on the other side. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever was to come. Then, I opened the door, and there he was. Colin, looking worse than ever. His clothes were rumpled, his face unshaven, and he had that hollow look in his eyes I had never seen before. He looked defeated, broken. For the first time, he actually looked scared. "What do you want, Colin?" I asked, not even trying to hide my exhaustion. He just stood there for a moment, his eyes darting around the apartment, avoiding my gaze. Then, he mumbled, "I screwed up, Ethan." "No kidding," I shot back, my voice laced with sarcasm. "What is it this time?" He walked into the apartment without waiting for an invitation and sank onto the couch, his body seeming to collapse in on itself. He looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "The gig didn't work out," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The client said my work wasn't what they were looking for. They stiffed me, and now I'm out of money, out of options. I don't know what to do." He finally met my gaze, his eyes filled with a desperation that was both unsettling and, if I was honest, a little bit pathetic. He looked like a lost child, desperately searching for a hand to hold. I leaned against the counter and crossed my arms, my body language conveying my skepticism. "So, you're here to ask for more money again?" Colin shook his head, looking genuinely defeated for the first time I could remember. "No," he said. "I know you're tired of helping me. I don't know where else to go." The anger I'd been holding on to began to crack, replaced by something else. Compassion, maybe, or just plain exhaustion. I couldn't tell anymore. "You could have had so much, Colin," I said softly, my voice laced with regret. "If you just put in the work, instead of waiting for someone else to fix everything for you." "I know," he said, his voice barely audible. "I thought I could do it. I thought if I just kept trying, it would all fall into place. I thought the big break was just around the corner, but I screwed up. I screwed everything up." For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken regrets and unfulfilled promises. Then, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Real regret. "Can I stay here?" he asked, his voice pleading. "Just for a few nights? I'll think of something. I promise, I'll get a job, anything." I stared at him, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to slam the door in his face, to finally cut him out of my life forever, to let him face the consequences of his actions once and for all. But another part of me, the part that remembered the kid who used to follow me around the backyard, copying everything I did, couldn't turn him away completely. He was still my brother. "2 nights," I finally said, my voice firm. "That's it. And if you're not out by then, I'm calling the cops." He nodded, looking relieved. "Thanks, Ethan," he said, his voice choked with emotion. I'll make it right. I swear." But deep down, I wasn't sure if I believed him anymore. He'd said those words so many times before, and they'd always turned out to be empty promises. That first night, Colin barely said a word. He crashed on the couch and stayed there, staring blankly at his phone or sleeping fitfully. I didn't press him. What was there to say? The damage was done, and I wasn't about to reopen the floodgates of excuses and justifications. The second night, I noticed a change. He began pacing the living room, muttering to himself, making frantic phone calls. From what I could overhear, he was reaching out to people, old friends, random contacts he'd met at those networking events, anyone who might give him a chance. He was actually trying, but I still didn't offer him any advice. I didn't even ask how he was doing. I let him figure it out on his own. He needed to prove to himself that he could do it. Then, just before midnight, he came into the kitchen, where I was sitting at the table, working on some bills. His face was pale, and he looked like he'd aged years in the last 2 days. But there was something different about him, a flicker of determination in his eyes. "I'm leaving," he said. I put down my pen and looked at him. "Have you found a place to go?" He nodded. "A guy I used to work with on a shoot has a spare room. It's not much, but it's something." He said I could stay there if I helped with the rent and got a job helping out around his studio. I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Are you going to do it?" "Yeah," he said, almost defiantly. "I've already applied for a couple of part-time jobs. Stocking shelves, flipping burgers, whatever. I'll take whatever I can get." I studied him for a long moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. He seemed different this time. More grounded, less cocky, more real. Maybe hitting rock bottom had finally knocked some sense into him. "Good," I said, my voice cautious. But don't think for a second that this fixes everything. You've got a long way to go before anyone trusts you again. I know, he said quietly. Then after a pause, he added, I'm sorry, Ethan, for everything. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I just wanted to say it. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to tell him that it was too late for apologies, that he'd burned every bridge he had, that he'd squandered every opportunity he'd been given. But another part of me, the part that still hoped that he could turn things around, wanted to believe him. Good luck, Colin, I finally said. He nodded, grabbed his well-worn duffel bag, and headed for the door. I didn't stop him. I didn't offer him a ride, or a handout, or even a goodbye hug. I just watched him go, feeling a strange mix of relief, sadness, and something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't closure, not exactly, but it was a step. That was the last I saw of Colin for a while. He vanished back into the city, swallowed up by the anonymity of its endless streets and its relentless churn of hopes and disappointments. He texted me a few times over the next few months, letting me know that he'd gotten a job stocking shelves at a grocery store, that he was working hard, that he was saving up for his own place, that he was starting to pay back some of the money he owed his roommate. He even mentioned photography a few times, saying that he was helping out at the studio in his spare time, learning new techniques and slowly building his portfolio again. He said the owner was impressed with his work ethic and that they were planning to collaborate on some projects. I didn't reply to most of his texts. I wasn't ready. I needed space. I needed time. I needed to focus on my own life and to rebuild the financial and emotional foundation that he'd so carelessly undermined. I didn't want to get my hopes up, only to have them crushed again. I didn't want to open myself up to the possibility of disappointment. I needed to protect myself. Maybe someday we'll patch things up. Maybe someday we'll be brothers again in the truest sense of the word. Maybe someday I'll be able to forgive him completely. But for now, I'm just trying to move on, to learn from my mistakes, to build a better future for myself. Sometimes helping someone means knowing when to stop, knowing when to draw the line, knowing when to let them fall so they can finally learn to stand on their own 2 feet. That's the hardest lesson I've ever had to learn, and it's one I'll never forget. So Reddit, Ada, maybe, I don't know. I did what I thought was best. I protected myself. I gave Colin a chance to grow. Whether he takes it or not is on him now, and that's all I can do.